And welcome back, Grief Nation listeners. Today on the show, we have a very special guest. We're welcoming in Reid Peterson. Reid, how are you?
Today, it's been one of those days, but we're just keeping it real.
All right. How is the weather there?
It's surprisingly cold and wet.
I was hoping to hear better news.
In the land of 300 days plus of sunshine, it's weird to get rain here. So it's a surprise.
Okay.
But I look at it as cleansing. It's just kind of cleansing our souls, cleansing our 2021, ready to let go of stuff. And so it's a big metaphor. I think it's perfect.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for saying that and mentioning that. We're going to just jump right in here. If you would have to describe yourself, who are you?
Well, I'm going to preface that by saying I think it changes day to day. But today I would say that I'm a compassionate soul. I'm a deep listener. I'm a lifelong griever. I'm a considerate husband, caring, human, and hey, let's even throw in a tech entrepreneur. How about that?
All right. Well, it's an honor for me to meet you. After speaking on yesterday, and I did get an opportunity to look over your app and everything. You're just amazing, exactly what the grief community needs. So if you could share your transition through those personal losses that became your greatest lead.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. My story, actually, that's one more thing I'd say about who I am. I'm a storyteller.
All right.
I kind of forgot that. My story of loss and living again goes back to 2006. And in 2006, my biological father died by suicide. And at the time that he died, I was about 1,500 miles away. I was in a program for graduate school. I kind of say it ironically, the type of school I was studying, it was Transpersonal Psychology. And the way I describe that is it was like these studies of practices that help people gain higher consciousness rather quickly. And so, there's a lot of Eastern-based meditation studies, there's yogic practice, there's even psychedelic drugs that are being studied. And so when he died, I kind of jumped into this mindset of like, wow, my dad's suffering is over, because my dad suffered from alcoholism and he also suffered from post-traumatic stress due to his active service in the Vietnam War and being exposed to Agent Orange. And so I felt a lot of relief. And at first it brought me joy. I genuinely and authentically felt relief that his life of suffering was over now. But then years went by and started feeling guilty about, as I'd recall memories of our experiences together and also that he was no longer here. So then 2 years after he passed, my stepdad, Warren, who was very active in my life, a father figure for me, he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and he battled that type of cancer for 8 years, June 3rd, 2016. And when he died, I had this perception of like, well, I've been here, done that, I should be good. But to my surprise, I actually felt more loneliness. I felt more sadness. And I just kind of rocked my world. So it got me to a place of seeking help in my local community. I live in the Santa Barbara, California area, and I found a bereavement support group, which was fantastic. I also found a grief counselor who was very, very good. And at the same time that I was having these positive experiences, I was really struggling with the in-between. I was noticing I would meet with the professional or the group members and feel comfort. But then a day or two later, I would recognize, oh, it's almost like the loneliness feels even that much more so. And so I feel like through that loss and through that grieving process, a seed was planted. And after doing some personal work for a couple of years, I found a mentor, a man named Alan Wolfelt, who provides grief education trainings. And I went through his program and got certified in death and grief studies, and eventually started what's called Grief Refuge, which is a mobile app for grief support.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. You said so much in there, and I really want to talk about male grief, and I'm so glad that you're on the show because a majority of my featured guests are women. So it's great to have the opposite, and to be able, so that we can have those eyes and ears to be able to see and know that, men grieve as well. They may grieve differently, but what are some of those common myths about male grief?
Well, I think the most common myth that comes to mind is that a man just doesn't want to talk about it. I say it's a myth because it's got almost like on the surface level, it's got a lot of truth to it. But I think that how I'd rephrase it is that a man doesn't want to talk about grief until he feels absolutely safe. And I think men stereotypically, I know there's exceptions to this, but men stereotypically almost like test their environment more than probably, a woman or a transgender, or I don't know. But it's like, it takes more time. That's more of the truth for a man to open up about his grief, because he's essentially tracking the environment and, kind of going back to the prehistoric days of biology and stuff like that, and some of the hunter-gatherer philosophies. It's always about hunting or being hunted. And so I feel like when grief and how heavy it can feel and how raw it can be for a man, he just needs to know that there's safety around him, and sometimes even safety within him, because grief can be so foggy and so detrimental in the experience before a man will talk about it.
Yeah. And I also think too, because at early ages, you are taught to be, strong, and, you're discouraged to even express and to be vulnerable, without any complaint, so I think that has a lot to do with it too, the way that a person was raised, because, even for myself, having 3 girls and 2 boys, I know there was a difference in, if my son cried, and it's like, oh, stop that, hold back your tears. So, kind of doing that wrong, but didn't know, because, that's how I was taught, so a lot of that does have to, I think, as far as men goes, and exactly to the point that you stated, that they have to feel safe. And we were teaching that, well, I know I can only speak for myself, but I was teaching my son wrong, for him not to be able to express himself, which led to more of the, like you said, not feeling safe and not wanting to express yourself. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, when you were going through a difficult time, what are some of the things that helped you?
I was really lucky, Miami, to live near the ocean. Mm-hmm. And I think there's powerful healing energy in the ocean. I don't know if it's like the negative ions they emit. But like, here's the metaphor that I've grasped onto, is that there's always something moving in the ocean. So there's always motion. And so I've come to learn that being on the shores, whether it's walking or just sitting there and essentially just staring out into the water.
Yeah.
But that energy has such power to it that it felt like it was helping things move through me, which was my own emotion. So that definitely was amazing in my experience. And I know that only a small percentage of people that are grieving live on the coast and have that ability to go near the water, such as salt water. So I'll also say hiking in itself, as a man, movement is really important, physical activity. I was just talking to a gentleman yesterday who was really struggling in his grief process, and he told me he's more mechanical. And, our minds may think, oh, mechanical, like he fixes stuff. But what he meant was he's that much more hands-on. And so just sitting and crying all day long is very, very hard for him. He's got to get up and he's got to move around. And I actually made a recommendation because he lives in a very kind of foresty, wooded area. I said, grab an axe and just start hacking away at some trees. Ask for a blessing first, but hack away at some trees, chop yourself some firewood, and put a lot of that emotion into motion. So remembering your question, being in nature, being at the ocean, and also hiking are probably the biggest pieces to helping me work through my own grief process.
I love that. I love the fact that you gave him an exercise to do, and further into your point earlier about the movement and getting him, going and actually being able to chop that wood and use it for good use to, create a warmthness, of his home, or just, putting it into the fire. Oh, I love that. Yummy. That was great. So you shared a little bit about Grief Refuge. Now, what are the benefits of this app?
Well, that's always been a challenge for me to say, because I'm not a tremendous marketer, but I can share what feedback has been provided to me from people who use it. They say that they feel daily inspiration, and that really helps them stay focused on their healing. They say the app is very voice activated. There's a lot of audio to it, so that they say that whoever that person is that narrates those daily refuge messages, they have a soothing voice, and that really helps them feel comforted. And then they say that the messages themselves, I like to call them musings, they're filled with compassion and they're filled with wisdom related to the grief process. Now, I'm putting air quotes around "the" because we know "the" really means your grief process. Everybody's just so unique.
Yeah.
Lastly, I think another benefit is, like, a lot of people also say that they feel validated, for all the thoughts and all the feelings that they have, because grief is complicated and there's a lot that goes on inward, as well as there's a lot that goes on outward in relationship to the world, in relationship to other people, other loved ones. And it just, hands down, I feel like the best word to describe it is complicated, but that's also normal. And then because it is technology based, it's just very convenient. A lot of people can access it at 3 a.m. when they're dealing with insomnia, and perhaps it can help them get back to sleep or something like that. So that's the feedback that's been shared with me. I appreciate you asking.
Oh, it's a wonderful tool to have. So I'm so grateful that I've got an opportunity to meet with you and speak with you and share that with my Grief Nation listeners, because a lot of times I know working with the gun violence prevention movement, we would often talk about, when we would have our sessions, moms would just talk. And we would definitely talk about that 3 o'clock in the morning. What could I do? You can, and then as a giver of who can support you, you can call me at 3 a.m, but I'm asleep. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, this is a great tool for someone that I don't necessarily have to, not that you feel like you're bothering people. And we definitely don't want to think that, if you have friends that says, call me at any time, but this is another tool that we know that will be there no matter what. So I'm so grateful that you had the courage to even go through that whole process, because I can only imagine how strenuous that was to build an app. That's amazing. So thank you for your gift that you're giving to the world.
Stay tuned. It's the Miami Night Show. We'll be right back. What's up, Grief Nation listeners, and thank you for tuning in to another segment on It's the Miami Night Show. I told you this season I was going to be bringing it, and we have Reid Peterson sharing his Grief Refuge app. So make sure you go and download this app so that you have a valuable tool for your unique journey.
Also, what has been the most important lesson that you've learned over your journey?
Well, it's just two words, go slow. I really think that, here's something that's really interesting about my whole experience in grieving and living. I've received many compliments from many people in all phases of life that have said, wow, Reid, you've got really good patience. And I agree with that. But when I look back a lot about some of my death-related losses with loved ones, I've pushed myself. I've really found myself way more anxious than in any other phase of life. And so I've learned that I've got to have patience. And along with that, it's almost like in order to have patience, you have to have self-compassion. And how I define self-compassion is like more of like that kind inner talk that happens within these walls up here. Just because like it's so easy to doubt, it's so easy to be hard on yourself, it's so easy to just be mean to me, and just doesn't get you anywhere, especially when you're grieving.
Yeah, that's so true. What are some best practices for others to understand the grieving process, you would say?
Ooh. Well, I think, what's interesting is in the age of the internet, I think that a lot of people who are in acute and raw grief, where it's like, it feels as new as it can be, and it, everything that's being felt and thought of right now is just way beyond intense. It's overwhelming. I think that a lot of people, lean towards the internet, and then they try to find something to read, whether that's a blog, an article, or maybe even finding a book. And I know that works for many, but I can't say that it works for all. And so with that said, I just want to say, because it's so convenient, you may think that you need to go find more information to help you understand your grief and understand the pain you're going through. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't advise against that. I'd just say that if it's not resonating with you, try a different mean. Try reaching out to some community member or something to see if there's resources that can be pouring your way, because it's so interesting. I mean, I'm willing to bet you've probably experienced this too, but you probably hear a lot from people who say, I just couldn't find what I needed. And then, they often assume that there's really no resources out there. Well, in grief, I think that there's a lot of resources available, and a lot of them are really good, but there's just something there. I'm still trying to understand this. There's still something there where people it's almost like they want to find themselves fit into the experience that is the resource, instead of like the resource helping to give them like a little bit of parameter or a little bit of guideline. And so coming back to your question, I think that just trust the process, that it will unfold, because so many people say, well, what do I do now? Like, I mean, my life just got flipped upside down. I've got so much pain. I don't even know if I'm going to make it through the day. Well, that all may feel true, but just trust the process unfolding before your eyes. So another way of saying that is like literally try to take it moment by moment.
Absolutely. And what do you do now? Go to Grief Refuge, the app. Yeah, start there, Wow. Yeah, because I found myself in that same situation. I remember when after a year, this was after a year after my son died by gun suicide, I just wanted to be normal. I wanted that for myself. And so I did a couple of things to help me get there, which was going to a vision board party, because, you know, even trying to go out was very difficult, you know, even to the grocery store, you know, all of those things were, just the normal things made me so anxious. So actually being invited somewhere and me actually saying, okay, I will go, really made a difference. But along that part of my journey, I still kept wondering, like, how am I going to be able to get this gut feeling every time that I hear suicide? How am I going to get rid of that? And so for me, when I kept having that experience, because it's like, you know, when you get a new car, you see it everywhere. So I was hearing it everywhere. Just all of a sudden, it was, you know, it was amplified. Suicide, suicide, suicide. So for me, I just did exactly what you stated, which was trust the process. And I kept asking Spirit to guide me to what I needed to help support me to be able to ingest this word, you know, to be able to be okay about it. And it still took me some time, but I started researching about suicide and, you know, how to get through grief through that. And that's how I found this training program on becoming a master grief coach. So being led, just like you said, you know, and trusting the process. Thank you so much for sharing that, because that's exactly what helped me along my journey. And it doesn't work for everyone, but please listen to what Reid said. Really great information, Reid. Are there any, I know you did talk about some things, some recommendations, but do you have any other resources like books or movies that you think that you could share with the audience?
Pretty much any movie these days, because I don't know about you, Miami, but like, I feel like every movie I find, I think even if you read the description, it's like, oh, this sounds like, you know, this would be good and be like relaxing, and like, oh wait, okay, there's grief in this movie.
Oh,
you know,
God, right, trigger.
in almost every show, you know, every program I watch,
Yeah.
you know, like,
Yeah.
I'm seeing it more with laughter and playfulness, and I'm also acknowledging that it can be hard for many people because of that triggering response.
Yeah.
But like almost every program, you know, there's something related to death and something related to loss and grief, and you know, I'm like, oh wow, this is like continuing education, because I'm kind of studying what I'm watching to see what kind of messaging they're portraying about grief. And you know, there's one in particular that my wife and I have been watching recently, although the show's a few years old now. It's called All American.
Oh, yeah.
And I love that because you know, I don't want to make a spoiler alert, but this young man is just trying to find his way, and there's a lot of pressure on him, and he feels responsible, and he also deals with loss in his life, a lot of loss in his life. And I'm appreciating that whoever wrote for this show, I feel like maybe they did do some of the training, the master grief coach training that you did or something, because not that they're sharing the story right or sharing the way of grieving process right, but they're sharing it in a healthy, authentic way. And I think that's the key word there, is just whatever's authentic.
And I think it's based off of just a true story. You know, so you have some validity there. So yeah, I think I love the show too. That's one of me and my daughter's favorite things to watch. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. So now, if you could go back and give yourself just one piece of advice about your grief experience, what would that be?
Well, I'm going to quote my mentor, Alan Wolfelt. He's got kind of this personal mantra, if you will. He says to himself before every time he would meet with a client, because he's a psychologist by training and he's been doing grief-related work for 40 years. He tells himself, no rewards for speed. And I think that's a beautiful phrase. And if I were to go back and give my own self-advice at a time of loss, I wouldn't probably say it to myself right away. I'd probably say it to myself perhaps maybe a couple months or a few months after the initial death of my loved one, when that became moments when I would say, well, you know, life has continued, the world keeps going around, and it's, you know, time for you to like man up and be a part of it now. And so no rewards for speed. And it helped acknowledge and accept that, you know, all the grief feelings, you know, they have their place.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this question earlier because of our conversation on yesterday, and you talked about the different losses that you've had over time. And what is the advice for, because this particular loss is often looked over when you're talking about either a sibling loss or a child loss, or it's rarely ever talked about. But you were sharing that you had lost I think your nephew or someone younger in your family. How can you, you're the sibling, correct? Or is it your?
It was my sister's kid.
Okay. So how, as a brother, experiencing that and having this, this event, this trauma in your family, or traumatic event, loss, whatever you want to consider it for you, how is supporting your sibling? Was it hard for you? I mean, because you love your sister, of course you love your
Some of the circumstances that made it difficult was that my sister, at the time she lost her child, I was, several, perhaps 1,500 miles away too. I guess this West Coast thing, there's just a lot of physical distance between a lot of me and my nuclear family members, because I grew up in the Midwest. And so this was before, video conferencing was a thing. So all I could do was talk to her on the phone. And I remember her getting very quiet, and I knew she was processing a lot of sadness. And for me, it was extremely uncomfortable because I was willing to sit within the uncomfortable silences and just hold space for that. And so that's the best that I could have showed up at the time. And, just really appreciating that if, as years have gone by, in fact, it's probably 15, 16 years later, and my sister and their family, they still celebrate his birthday. And I think that's a beautiful experience. So I think, in essence, Miami, I just want to make sure that I'm always, even if I have a judgment, I remind myself, hey, it's not about me. It's really about them. And so the more I can show up empathetically, and the more I can just kind of leave my judgments at the door, that's the best way I feel like I can show up and support.
Yeah, I think that's so, I really truly believe that we should have had that conversation to help other people to mend relationships or whatever it is at the time, because as you know, there's always sibling rivalry sometimes, but when someone is going through something so tragic, how do we show up for them? And if it's just holding space, it needed to be said, because I know sometimes, both of my siblings have passed now, but I know we have had times that we didn't get along at all. But when the family had to come together, they came together. And if it's like you said, just holding space. But I think in even today's time now, where there's it's the COVID era, and we're not really able to gather, how can we still be able to hold space for one another? And if that's just sitting and being silent, as you stated, it has to be talked about to say it's okay to do, because sometimes people just need to hear you say, just do that, So thank you for sharing that. I know that was really off base of what we were talking, but I wanted people to hear how you would, whatever your suggestion was, to be able to support their sibling, because I know it wasn't your sibling that was lost, it was your sibling's child, but how to handle sibling grief is not talked about rarely. So it's almost like it's a stigmatized loss, because we don't talk about that. But I definitely wanted to open the floor to be able to say, how can I assist my sibling that maybe have had a loss? Okay, so you on your podcast, and also your app, you have talked about 5 ways guilt can impact grief. Can you share that with us?
So I think the easiest one to conceptualize is survivor guilt, because we mostly see that in a lot of the films and the shows that are produced, as well as it's a real experience, especially in military service. And that's pretty much saying it should have been me. I should have been the person who died. And there's many reasons for thinking that way. But in a nutshell, survivor guilt is the first. There's also relief guilt. I alluded to that as part of my story when my biological father, when he died. And I'm trying to think of if I could just say one additional thing about relief guilt, because it was such a part of my experience. I guess I didn't allude to this earlier, but boy, did I feel not singled out, but did I feel like an outsider looking in, because I even remember at my dad's service, I was one of the speakers. And afterwards, my mom, who had a terrible relationship with my dad, she looked at me and she said, "So you really feel joy, don't you?" And as the years went on, I remember her saying that to me, and it almost like that memory fed more of the guilt. And so, yeah, that was a tough one for me. You can have joy guilt, which might be thought of similar as relief guilt, but the difference is in joy guilt, it's like you just almost feel you're good, you recognize, oh, I'm at a service, we're honoring somebody who has passed. Everybody is, wiping tears away. Everybody's feeling deep sadness. Everybody's feeling hurt, but you're not experiencing that. So it's often referred to, well, I still feel joyful, or at least content. So that's one other type. Another one is called magical thinking. And with magical thinking, it's got a little bit similarities to survivor guilt, but the difference is that you feel guilty because you've probably had thoughts, of somebody passing, maybe in your own mind, you've expressed some inner rage, or you've expressed some ill wishes. And then now all of a sudden, the person physically does die. And so a lot of people say, well, it was my fault because I thought them to death. And so that's, a different type of guilt. And that's called magical thinking. And then the last one is just more about long-standing personality factors. So if somebody grew up feeling a lot of guilt for whatever reasons, just family dynamics, etc., that can contribute to a lot of guilt that's felt during the grieving process too. Now, I'll go out on a limb, Miami, and I'll say with long-standing personality factors, I think that, I don't know if it's most subcultures within American culture, but I don't know, a bit of our history. I think there's a lot of history in American society of how we've been brought up and things that have happened to races, to ethnicities, to certain groups and cultures. I feel like I've yet to work with anybody, whether it be in groups or individually, who has said, I've never experienced guilt as a child. And so just wanted to mention that too, is it's common and it's normal to be raised feeling a bit guilty for whatever reasons. I have 4 siblings, and I was I think in larger family structures, certain things happen with certain. I think I'm starting to head into a little bit of the psychology of everything. So I'm gonna take a step back and just say those are the 5 categorized ways of guilt can impact grief.
Hey, teach us. We on this show, I like for my listening audience to learn as much as they can. And I know you said that's going into the psychology piece of it, but a lot of times people use this as a resource to be able to support themselves without, and trust me, I'm not stating, oh, don't go and seek therapy or talk to someone. But a lot of times people, because of culture, they just feel that that's not for me, but they'll watch our podcast or they'll listen to Grief Refuge. So anywhere where you can drop us some knowledge, we will accept that. And I truly appreciate learning about the types of guilt, because I can identify myself in each one of them, from the childhood, long-standing personality factor, the magical guilt that I had that with my sister, the survivor's guilt, that was my son, because of his story of losing his best friend in the initial shooting, and he dies by gun suicide 5 years later because that whole traumatic event that he was a part of as well. Still even today, on the death anniversary of his friend's murder, and my son was shot that same night, we still contribute that day to his suicide, because we know had that day hadn't happened, my son would probably still be here. That's how we feel. But on the other side of that, I also feel that, out of everything that has occurred, his time here was his time here. So even though I can still think that and understand about the survivor's guilt and the relief guilt, I had some of that too, because my son had struggled for the 5 years after his best friend was killed, and he was also shot, and he was dealing with a traumatic brain injury. When he finally passed, it was like, oh, he's not suffering anymore. Because I seen the suffering, I seen the rehab, I saw all of that he had to go through. And then at some point I did have that relief. And, sometimes when people hear that, they're like, that was a relief for you? Yes, it was, because he was no longer hurting. He was no longer suffering, because I was there, I saw him in the hospital. I was, at every rehab appointment. I was there at every psychology appointment. I was there with every therapist appointment, so I do know, how that impacted him. So thank you so much for sharing those 5 types of guilt. Now, where can my listeners find you?
I think the easiest is the old school way. We'll throw out a website, griefrefuge.com. That, there's links to social media stuff. That's where the app can be gotten. It's just kind of like still the hub of where to find me.
Right. Well, thank you so much. My featured guest this. So share with us, is there anything within the community that you would like to see change or bring some attention or awareness within the grief community?
Well, I think that you said the key word earlier, Miami. Still things are stigmatized, and I'd really like to see more and more grief related, unique grief experiences feel normalized, feel more welcomed, and just feel more honored. It's kind of interesting, I also want to say, I'll share a short story. When I was in graduate school, a classmate, he died by suicide. And here I was at this graduate school where, we were learning, how to find higher consciousness, like at the snap of a finger. And when there was a memorial for John, and at his memorial, there was even a very successful book author invited to speak. And what had happened was, it really crushed me, because this service was maybe a week after he died. And here I was sitting in this space where people were talking about just, the beauty of his spirit living in immortality. And I thought to myself, whether that's true or not, it just didn't feel right. Not in the form of right or wrong, but more in the form of where can someone grieve and mourn here? Where can where's there room or an invitation to express the pain, to express the loss? And that really stuck with me because that actually was the first time I ever experienced that. I know that a lot of people lean towards life celebrations now, and I respect that. I think there is a lot of positive experience in people celebrating one's life in memory. But I also just want to make sure in answering your question that there's also room for people to feel the pain and not feel like they're being judged for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, you have been an amazing featured guest on It's the Miami Night Show Grief Talk. Thank you so much for reaching out to us and coming on the show.
Miami, you're welcome. Thank you for having this show. This is a great experience. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, there you have it, Grief Nation listeners, and thank you for tuning in to another transformative segment on It's the Miami Night Show Grief Talk. Today, we give thanks filled with love and gratitude to our special guests for expressing your very unique grief journey and sharing ways of understanding the healing process. This is your girl, Miami Night, with much love and light until we connect again spiritually. Bye-bye.
Slow-mo. He's got me walking that grief walk. Going slow-mo. He's got me talking that grief talk. Going slow-mo. He's got me clocking it.
It's the Miami Night Show.
Hey, yeah. Slow-mo. He's got me walking that grief walk. Going slow-mo. He's got me talking that grief talk. Going slow-mo. He's got me clocking it.
What up, tribe? It's Miami Night Show Master Grief Coach. Welcome to the Miami Night Show. He got me walking that grief walk. It's time for Grief Talk, y'all.
I talk about things you think about.
It's Miami Night Show Master Grief Coach.